Thanksgiving used to be my favorite day of the year, not because of the turkey or the pie. At my age, food was just food. What I loved was the sound of people in my house, the laughter, the clatter of plates, my daughter's voice calling from the kitchen, my grandson running down the hallway like the floor belonged to him. But this Thanksgiving morning, the house was silent. I woke up early, the way older people do. The sun was barely up, and the autumn light slipped quietly through the kitchen window. Outside, the maple tree in my yard had already lost most of its leaves. They lay scattered across the lawn like pieces of a memory. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table I'd owned for nearly 40 years. That table had seen a lot of life: birthday cakes, school projects, my daughter Emily learning how to write her name while I guided her small hand across the page. I smiled at the thought. Emily had always been strong-willed, even as a little girl. If she wanted something, she chased it with a fire that made me proud. When her mother passed away 20 years ago, Emily and I became each other's whole world. At least, that's what I believed. I took a sip of coffee and glanced at my phone on the table. It vibrated softly. A message. I expected something simple. Happy Thanksgiving, Dad. Maybe even a photo of my grandson, Oliver, with mashed potatoes on his face. Instead, I saw a message that felt strangely cold. It was from Emily. I opened it slowly. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misunderstood the words, but they were clear. Dad, you need to stop expecting us to take care of you when you're old. We have our own lives. So forget about us helping you in the future. I stared at the screen. The words didn't just sit there. They echoed, like someone shouting in an empty room. Forget about us helping you. We have our own lives. For a long time, I didn't move. The coffee in my hand cooled while I read the message again and again. Emily had always been direct, but this felt different. Not frustrated, not tired, just dismissive. Like I had become an inconvenience she wanted to address early. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. The refrigerator still held the drawing Oliver made for me last year. A crooked stick figure with gray hair. Underneath it, he had written in wobbly letters, Grandpa. My chest tightened. Had I asked too much? I tried to remember the last time I'd asked Emily for anything. I paid for my own home, my own groceries, my own medical bills. When Oliver needed braces 2 years ago, I quietly wrote the check. When Emily and her husband were struggling with their mortgage 5 years back, I helped them keep the house. Not because they asked, because family helps family. At least, that was the way I had been raised. I picked up the phone again. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to reply, to ask what I had done wrong, to tell her I never expected anything from her except maybe a little kindness. But something inside me stopped. At 73 years old, you learn that some words reveal more truth than explanations ever could. I set the phone down. The silence in the kitchen returned. Outside, a light wind pushed a few leaves across the porch. For the first time that morning, I noticed something strange. The message hadn't just hurt. It had clarified something. For years, I believed love meant always giving, always understanding, always forgiving. But there's a quiet moment in life when you realize that love without respect slowly becomes something else, something smaller, something painful. I stood up and rinsed my coffee mug in the sink. The water ran steadily as I stared out the window. I thought about Emily as a little girl, the first time she rode a bicycle, the night she cried after her first heartbreak, the day she graduated college and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Those memories were real, but so was the message on my phone. People grow, people change, and sometimes the hardest truth is realizing that the person you protected for years no longer sees you the same way. I dried my hands with a towel and walked back to the table. My phone lit up again. Another message from Emily. For a brief second, I wondered if she was apologizing. Maybe she had typed the first message in frustration. Maybe she regretted it. I opened the screen, but it wasn't an apology. It was a second message. Just wanted to be clear, so there are no expectations later. That sentence sat there like a locked door. No expectations. I slowly nodded to myself. All right, I whispered. Not in anger, not in sadness, just understanding. Because sometimes people don't realize the weight of their words, but time has a quiet way of making those words matter. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused on a name I hadn't called in years. My lawyer. The Thanksgiving turkey sat uncooked in the refrigerator. But suddenly, I had something else to do that morning. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. It had been years since I'd last stepped inside that building. The brass letters on the glass door still read, Harrison and Cole, Attorneys at Law. I remembered the day I first walked in there with my late wife, Margaret. We had been younger then, nervous but hopeful, signing the first version of our will. Back then, the future felt long and generous. Now it felt quieter. When I pushed the door open, a small bell chimed overhead. A young receptionist looked up from her computer and gave me a polite smile. Good morning. Can I help you? Yes, I said gently. I have an appointment with Mr. Harrison. She nodded and picked up the phone. A few moments later, the door to the back office opened. Daniel? I recognized the voice immediately. Thomas Harrison had aged the same way I had, a little slower in his movements, a little more gray in his hair, but his eyes were still sharp. Good to see you, he said, extending his hand. It's been a while. Yes, I replied with a faint smile. Life tends to do that. He led me down a quiet hallway and into his office. The room looked almost exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Bookshelves filled with thick legal volumes, a wide wooden desk, a window that overlooked the street below. I sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Thomas leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. So, he said gently, what brings you in today? I reached into my coat pocket and placed my phone on the desk. I need to change my will. He nodded slowly. That's certainly something we can do. There was no judgment in his voice, just quiet professionalism. Is everything all right with your daughter? He asked carefully. Thomas had helped draft my will before. He knew that nearly everything I owned, my house, my savings, and the investment account that had grown over the years, was meant for Emily. Nearly $5 million in total. Money I had spent decades building. Money I believed would help secure her future and Oliver's education. I looked out the window for a moment before answering. Emily sent me a message this morning, I said. I slid the phone across the desk. Thomas adjusted his glasses and read the words slowly. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't comment right away. When he finished reading, he placed the phone back down between us. I see, he said quietly. The room grew still. Some lawyers might have asked questions, some might have offered opinions, but Thomas simply waited, and I appreciated that. I'm not angry, I said after a moment. That's good, he replied softly. But I am awake. He nodded. I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. When Margaret and I made the original will, I continued, we believed we were doing what parents always do. What's that? Thomas asked. Preparing the road for our child. I smiled faintly at the memory. Everything I worked for was meant to make Emily's life easier. Thomas didn't interrupt. But this morning, I said slowly, I realized something. What's that? If someone has already decided they owe you nothing, then you should stop pretending otherwise. The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded clear. Thomas nodded again, this time more thoughtfully. And what changes would you like to make? He asked. I took a slow breath. I want to remove Emily from the inheritance. The sentence settled quietly between us. Thomas didn't react dramatically. He had likely heard far worse family stories in his career. Instead, he simply asked, completely? Yes. And your grandson? At the mention of Oliver, my chest softened slightly. Oliver was only 12, still kind, still curious, still the boy who once gave me a drawing of a rocket ship and told me we would visit the moon together someday. I want to set up a small education trust for Oliver, I said, for college, something that ensures he has opportunities. Thomas made a note. And the rest? I looked down at my hands. For many years, I had believed money only belonged within family. But age teaches you something important. Sometimes the world contains people who need kindness more than those who simply expect it. There's a children's hospital Margaret used to support, I said quietly, and a scholarship fund at the local college. Thomas's pen moved steadily across the paper. I felt something unusual inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness, relief. Thomas looked up again. "Daniel," he said carefully, "changes like this can create family tension." I gave a small smile. "That tension already exists," I replied. Outside the window, cars moved along the street. People hurried past on the sidewalk, carrying bags and coffee cups, unaware of the quiet decisions being made in this room. Thomas turned the papers toward me. "If you're certain," he said. I read the document slowly. Every line felt calm, measured, deliberate. Finally, I signed my name. The pen scratched gently against the paper, and just like that, 30 years of assumptions quietly changed direction. Thomas placed the papers into a folder. "When would you like Emily to be informed?" he asked. I shook my head slightly. "I won't be informing her." "Then how will she know?" I stood and put on my coat. "Life has a way of revealing things," I said. Thomas walked me to the door. Before I stepped out, he spoke again. "Daniel," I turned. "You handled this with remarkable calm." I smiled faintly. "When you live long enough," I said, "you learn something important." "What's that?" "Peace is worth more than being understood." Outside, the cold autumn air brushed against my face. Thanksgiving afternoon had arrived, and for the first time in many years I felt strangely steady. But I didn't yet know that before the sun went down, someone would be pounding on my front door. The sun was already slipping behind the rooftops when I returned home. Late November evenings grow dark quickly. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the streetlights had begun to glow softly along the quiet road. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Families inside their warm homes, televisions humming, the smell of roasted turkey drifting faintly through the air. Thanksgiving was happening everywhere, just not inside my house. I stepped through the front door and hung my coat on the old wooden rack near the hallway. The house greeted me with the same silence it had held that morning. For a moment, I stood there listening. The ticking clock in the living room, the distant wind outside. Nothing else. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The turkey was still sitting there, untouched. Earlier in the week, I had bought it out of habit, assuming Emily and Oliver might stop by for dinner like they sometimes used to. Old habits can linger long after people stop showing up. I closed the refrigerator door and leaned against the counter. Strangely, I didn't feel angry. There was sadness, yes. A deep, quiet sadness that moved slowly through my chest. But it wasn't sharp or explosive. It felt more like the slow acceptance that comes when something you believed in begins to fade. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read Emily's message that morning. Outside, a car passed down the street. Then another. I stared at the small drawing Oliver had made for me last year, still taped to the refrigerator, a stick figure with gray hair. Grandpa. My heart softened. Children rarely understand the tensions that grow between adults. Oliver probably had no idea what his mother had written to me. In his world, I was still the man who showed him how to fish and let him stay up late during sleepovers. I hoped that part of our relationship would survive. I had just lifted the coffee mug to my lips when a loud knock struck the front door. 3 sharp bangs. Not the gentle knock of a guest. Something urgent, something angry. I set the mug down slowly. Before I could stand, the knocking came again, harder this time. Bang, bang, bang. Then a voice followed. "Dad, open the door." Emily. Her voice was sharp, strained, almost trembling. I stood up calmly and walked down the hallway. When I opened the door, cold evening air rushed inside. Emily stood on the porch, her coat half buttoned, her hair slightly disheveled, like she had rushed out of the house without thinking. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was her face. She looked furious. Her eyes burned with a kind of anger I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. The moment the door opened, she stepped forward. "How could you do this?" she shouted. Her voice echoed across the quiet street. I remained still. "Hello, Emily," I said gently. "Don't hello me," she snapped. She waved her phone in the air. "I just got off the phone with Mr. Harrison." I nodded slightly. "I see." "You removed me from the will?" she continued, her voice rising. $5 million, Dad. You just erased me like I'm nothing." Her words poured out quickly, one after another. "You think that's fair? After everything? After all these years?" I watched her quietly. Anger has a way of revealing what someone values most. Emily paced across the porch, her hands shaking. "You're punishing me over a text message?" I tilted my head slightly. "Are you certain it was only a text message?" I asked calmly. She froze. For a moment, the wind moved through the trees above us, rustling the last few leaves. Emily stared at me like she was trying to read my thoughts. "You completely overreacted," she said finally. I was just being honest. "Yes," I replied softly. "You were." My calmness seemed to make her even more frustrated. She stepped closer. "Do you realize how this makes me look?" she demanded. That question hung in the air. Not how this makes you feel. Not why would you do this. How this makes me look. I felt something inside my chest settle even deeper. "Emily," I said quietly, "this morning you told me something very clear." Her jaw tightened. "You said I shouldn't expect anything from you when I'm old." "That's not what I meant." "It is exactly what you wrote." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since arriving, her voice fell silent. I continued gently. "I believed you." The porch light flickered softly above us. Emily shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" "Yes. Families say things they don't mean all the time." I nodded slowly. "That's true." She crossed her arms, waiting. "But when someone takes the time to write something twice," I continued calmly, "they usually mean it." Her eyes widened slightly. She remembered the second message. Just wanted to be clear so there are no expectations later. The silence between us grew heavier. Finally, she spoke again, though her voice had lost some of its earlier force. "You're really going to do this?" "I already have." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Perhaps she didn't. For many years, I had been the father who quietly tolerated everything, the one who forgave quickly, the one who kept giving. But age has a way of changing people, not into something cruel, into something clearer. Emily took a shaky breath. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're just cutting me off?" I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said gently. "I'm simply accepting the future you described." Her eyes filled with frustration again, but this time there was something else mixed in. Uncertainty, because deep down, she was beginning to understand something important. Actions can be undone, but words sometimes echo longer than we expect. And this Thanksgiving evening was far from over. Emily stood on the porch for a long time after that. The anger that had filled her voice when she first arrived slowly faded into something quieter, something uncertain. The cold November wind moved gently through the street, brushing past the trees and carrying the distant sounds of families celebrating Thanksgiving inside their homes. Neither of us spoke for a while. Sometimes silence reveals more truth than arguments ever could. Finally, Emily exhaled slowly and stepped back from the doorway. The fight seemed to have drained out of her shoulders. "You're serious about this?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes," I replied calmly. She looked past me into the house, as if searching for the father she had always known. The man who fixed things, the man who said yes, the man who absorbed every careless word and smoothed it over with patience. But that man had simply learned something new. Respect matters. "I didn't think you would actually do something like this," Emily admitted. "That may be the problem," I said gently. She frowned. "What do you mean?" I rested my hand against the doorframe, speaking carefully. For many years, Emily, you believed I would always accept whatever you gave me. That's not fair, she replied quickly. Isn't it? She looked away toward the street. Cars passed slowly under the streetlights, their headlights sliding across the quiet pavement. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, she muttered. I nodded softly. Maybe not. But sometimes what we say in frustration is the truth we've been carrying quietly. Emily didn't answer. Her silence told me more than words ever could. For a long time, we had both played roles in a story that no longer fit us. I had continued giving without boundaries, believing that love alone could hold everything together, but love without respect slowly becomes something fragile, something that bends until it finally breaks. I didn't raise you expecting payment for being your father, I said gently, and I never planned my life around being taken care of. She looked up at me. Then why change the will? The answer came easily. Because your message showed me something important. What? That you had already separated your life from mine. Her expression tightened slightly. You said you had your own life, I continued. And that's a natural thing. Children grow up, they build families, they move forward. That doesn't mean I don't care about you, she said. I hope you do, I replied softly. The porch light hummed faintly above us. But caring and respecting someone are not the same thing. Emily opened her mouth as if to argue, but the words never came. After a moment, she asked quietly, So where does that leave us? It was the first honest question she had asked since arriving, and it deserved an honest answer. It leaves us exactly where we should be, I said. She looked confused. As father and daughter, I explained. Not as obligations, not as expectations. Just two people who can still choose how they treat each other. Her eyes softened slightly. And the money? She asked carefully. I smiled faintly. The money was never the important part. For a long time I had believed that leaving everything to Emily was the natural end of my story. But that belief had slowly turned into something else, something tied to fear, responsibility, and unspoken assumptions. Now those assumptions were gone. I've arranged for Oliver to have help with his education, I told her. She blinked in surprise. You did? Yes. Relief flickered briefly across her face. And the rest? She asked. Some will go to places that helped your mother when she was sick, I said quietly. Hospitals, scholarships, opportunities for people who need them. Emily stared at the floor of the porch. The wind moved a few leaves across the driveway. I guess I didn't think about it that way, she said after a moment. Most people don't. Money has a strange way of shaping expectations before anyone notices. Eventually, Emily stepped back from the door. I should go, she said. I nodded. All right. She hesitated before turning toward the steps. Dad? Yes. I was angry this morning, she admitted. Work has been stressful. Things with the house. Oliver's school. Her voice trailed off. Excuses, but also explanations. I understand, I said gently. She looked up at me again, searching my face for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe reassurance. What she found instead was calm. Emily, I said softly, the door of this house has always been open to you. She nodded slowly. But this time, there was an understanding between us that hadn't existed before. Love still lived here, but now it stood beside something equally important. Boundaries. Emily walked down the porch steps and toward her car. The engine started, the headlights turned on, and a moment later she drove away into the quiet night. I closed the door and returned to the kitchen. The house was silent again, but it felt different now. Not lonely, just peaceful. I made myself a small Thanksgiving dinner that evening. Nothing fancy, just warm food and a quiet table. Before sitting down, I looked at Oliver's drawing on the refrigerator, the little stick figure with gray hair. Grandpa. I smiled. Life has a way of teaching lessons when we least expect them, and this Thanksgiving taught me something I wish I had learned years earlier. Love should always be given freely, but respect must always be protected, Because when a person learns to stand calmly in their own dignity, they don't lose their family. They simply discover who truly belongs in it.